Despite the warning you just saw 2 seconds ago, I think it's not wrong to say that pretty much everyone has at the very least seen this fella around. If the Pope cannot escape it, how the fuck are you supposed to? If you've been seeing my socials, you know that I'm in my nostalgia era with Undertale after not having really interacted with it in 5 years. And seeing what the state of the fandom is in regards to this game is fascinating. It's calmed down in many aspects, and then others that I'd rather not get into today, my lord. The most interesting thing, however, is to see how the discussion around Sans has changed. Most people have gone through the overhypedness of him and have come back to appreciate his character, isolated from the overpopularity that he's received. But also seeing an attempt to make up for it by kinda going the other wrong direction. Looking at this image, it kinda summarizes it pretty well. Sans has sort of become a dress-up doll people can use to make new characters with and learn in the process how to make characters, and that in itself is really fun and encouraging. However, there is another side that has warped his personality over time, which is people not being able to agree how to correctly portray Sans. No one really being able to nail it down, me included. While I do take the cooler fanon title like a badge of honor, it's still labeled as fanon rather than completely accurate to his character. It's kind of funny how the best characterization I've seen of him in fan content so far is in DELTATRAVELER. What's funny is that the reason it feels so accurate is his lack of involvement in the main plot so far, emphasis on so far, that it feels almost one-to-one how his role is presented for most of it in the pacifist run. If you look into the ways the fandom has portrayed him, it kinda goes into 3 categories. The protector, the aggressor, and the pure jokester. Both protector and aggressor being the very emotional type of Sans, just ranging between the general morality of his character, while the jokester is, well, basically the mean guy. And that got me curious. What is it that gave this division of portrayal of a seemingly simple character? Mischaracterization is nothing new in fandoms, but the stark contrast is really fascinating. So, what happened? Before diving into the main topic, it's important to acknowledge one key aspect for the rest of this video: the fact that Sans has clear nihilistic depression. This is hinted at by his lack of self-care, his very rare moments talking about himself, the presumable eye bags in his eye sockets, the entire first phase dialogue of the fight, and let's not forget that this bitch is walking around in his damn morning slippers. And that realization can lead to different ways as to how you look at Sans and how he should be portrayed. Depression is a difficult emotion to convey, and it is also frankly a varying emotion as not everyone handles it the same way. When people started to make up for what I'm gonna call the 2016 shonenification of Sans, people started writing him as genuinely uncaring and an asshole, some even feeling like it presents their experience with nihilism much more accurately. Seriously, I feel like this is a conspiracy theory, but does anyone else feel like Jax from Digital Circus may have contributed to the overcorrection? I swear it started from there! I love the bastard, but can you see it?! But sort of like autism, you'd be hard-pressed to find people within the spectrum who actually act the same way as the other. And while Sans definitely has trouble finding meaning in his everyday action, it's also evident from his neutral ending dialogues that he cares quite a lot, just not in the way you think he should. And, well, I relate to that personally. While I have never been diagnosed, as I grew up away from the franchise, I experienced quite a few episodes of just emptiness and lack of caring that just comes with things you learn and start believing over time. How your actions seem to not matter in the grand scheme of things and look for any excuse to sort of wallow in it, letting your defeatism be the perfect excuse to not act, even when a part of you shows great remorse for said inaction. Again, I don't think I've nailed him down completely either, but I think this emotional connection that I only gained as an adult has really made me understand his core a bit better. He's aged like fine wine to me. That's not to say that kids don't experience depression, but writing in a way that conveys your exact feelings is difficult, especially when you don't fully understand them. That's why I think people resorted to the easiest way to depict that hollowness in a more in-your-face manner. And with what we see Sans do in the game, it's no surprise that people got a bit confused by his main characteristics, which there is one single scene to really blame for. And no, I'm not talking about his fight. While important for a specific aspect I will bring up here, it's more the climax to probably the best setup for final boss I have ever seen, as it is the scene that changed Sans. With all the mysteries that this game contains, with so many unanswered questions, the date with Sans has got to be the most confusing part of the game. I know it might sound weird, but really think about how layered this conversation is. If you look at it completely surface level, you're not gonna question your first reading over it and move on. It's only the more you think about it where you actually make a double take, as there is a lot going on in this single scene. Let's establish first everything that's happened up to this point before jumping back and forth with later context. Well, sort of. When you meet Sans in Snowdin, he first gives you the impression of someone intimidating, only to subvert it with his whoopee cushion gag. From here on, he just pops up everywhere assisting Papyrus, sort of, while also annoying him as any good sibling would, giving you some advice in the process, but mostly just being a jokester as you roam around. After you're done with Snowdin, you move on to Waterfall and meet him to then hang out at Grillbys. You here get to see how he interacts with everyone, a pretty popular guy who makes people laugh with his jokes. The whole scene is mostly just talking about Papyrus, with only a certain dialogue branch revealing how he likes Papyrus pushing him to do more while calling him lazy, even if, in his words, couldn't be further from the truth. Personally, I look at this more him saying that it's not really laziness and more his depression preventing him from doing more, but that's just my read on it. Not that it matters, but I so rarely look at this interaction that I completely forgot how blunt he is here if you insult Papyrus. Needs a little detail, I guess. Either way, the conversation then shifts as he starts talking about Flowey. He mostly presumes that Papyrus is most likely being pranked by someone with echo flowers, but with later context you can get from Flowey himself, it's likely he just wanted to see our reaction to it. We'll spin back to this later. What's important to already note here is that while Sans is largely irrelevant for the plot of the main narrative, this establishes a possible connection he has with Flowey shenanigans, already giving the impression that he knows more than he leads on. But then the scene moves on and you get back on your way through Waterfall. For the next two areas, he's sort of in the background, not really engaging with anything and just sort of there for the fun hijinks. Pranking you with a telescope, handing out toilet paper as tickets with Shayy, sleeping while you're being chased by Undyne, and then lastly selling hot dogs. That second last one in particular is interesting as you first get angry he isn't there to help you if you interact with him, but as you run, Undyne actually stops for a moment there too, giving you enough time to escape to the other end of the bridge. Was it on purpose to help you, or was it to piss you both off? You can't quite tell at this moment just yet. Everywhere you go, it's like he's just following you no matter what, and something about that makes the lonely journey you're on a little more comforting. Sure, you're free to ignore him completely, but it's kinda nice to have a familiar face pop up every once in a while, even without the phone calls. Finally, just before you enter the core, you get to the Entity Resort, and who's waiting for you at the door? Sans. You walk up to him, and he invites you to a last dinner with him. Here we get another one of his shortcuts, and you both sit at the table having a chat. Or rather, a monologue, to be honest. I'll try not to drag this out, so I'll try my best to summarize the sections as best I can. The first thing he tells us is asking about if we really want to go through with getting out, sympathizing with the desire of wanting to go back home, but wondering if it might not be better to just do with what is given to you. He recognizes our determination, so he doesn't make us sit with it too long, but him opening with this is rather sad, this being the first time he's kind of vulnerable to us. Everything before was just jokes or all about Papyrus, so this is the first time in the game where he actually talks about himself. Then we of course get the story of him meeting Toriel and the kinship they develop through their love of jokes. With Toriel's loneliness being more emphasized with this, Sans telling his own homesickness shows a deep connection they develop for a similar feeling of isolation, whether they are aware of each other's past traumas or not. Then comes the promise, her plea to ask him to watch over us and protect us. When hearing this, it makes him pop up everywhere makes sense now. He's been around to keep an eye out, a guardian angel brought by none other but our goat mom we left behind. Despite it having been around 4 hours at this point, her care still echoes through our journey as the role of guardian was passed down to Sans. It feels comforting, safe. It's unclear how he has really protected us at this moment, but one can speculate how he may have been doing things in the background. Falling asleep in Hotland now reads as him actually helping us. It's a very sweet moment, until suddenly Sans pulls the rug under us, declaring that if it hadn't been for the promise, we'd be dead where we stand. This is what completely shatters whatever idea we had about Sans up to this point. He laughs it off as a joke right after, but the damage is done. Nothing could make us forget the literal threat he just uttered towards us. The watching has turned from comforting to haunting. Sans then clarifies his definition of protection, saying he's done pretty well considering we haven't died a single time. If he really didn't, this might not really mean much, but chances are on the first playthrough you probably kicked the bucket in a stupid way before. Him saying that with that context confirms how lacking he really was in that attempt of protection if he wasn't aware how close to death we've come. Feeling your reaction, he goes,
"Hey, what's that look supposed to mean? Am I wrong?"
He walks away telling you to take care as someone really cares about us, officially letting his role as protector behind now. That last bit about our deaths is something I want to circle back to, but let's discuss what just happened. We have a promise of protection, we got a literal death threat, and then we got a joke making fun of our death tally. If you focus on the threat, you take his aggression seriously and could see it as him stating how much he hates you or humanity. If you focus on the promise and vulnerability, you will believe his comment on the threat being a joke just to mess with you and see him as a protective figure. If you focus on his lazy attempt at protection mocking your tally, you'll see him as an uncaring jokester. These are 3 entirely different ways you can look at this convo, which directly parallels the 3 ways how people depict Sans in the fandom. Looking at the surface of this, the black and white approach to how you look at the scene will change how you look at Sans from this moment forward. And it's even crazier that when you then go through further in the game, this entire conversation starts to make 0 sense. Rationally at least. If Sans was as protective as he claims to be through that promise, why didn't he intervene with Papyrus or frankly any of the monsters? Why wait until literally no one is left to actually fight you if he cared that much? But if he doesn't care, why does he form that connection? Why would he be the judge to give you this verdict and completely abandon his neutrality to call you out on killing his brother? If he really is that aggressive, why did he just let himself get captured by Flowey when we know he could go against him if he wanted to? If the promise really meant that much to him, why half-ass it as he does? All of what we know of Sans is contradicting and doesn't really give you clear answers, which is why I don't blame anyone for just focusing on one of those 3 takeaways, as trying to fit them together makes it look like a mess. That is, if you look at Sans as a one-dimensional character. Remember what I said about people not knowing how to write people with depression? This is what I mean. None of these pieces make any sense if you take them completely at face value. It's only when you accept Sans as a flawed but good person that things start to fit together that only a human could really embody. Or monster, I suppose in this case. You can still make your own interpretation to what makes sense outside of my own view, but what I want to really mean with this is that it's impossible to get a proper read on him if you treat him as a simple guy with one-note traits. It's only when you go out of your way to make him more layered that you get a way closer depiction of him. It might still vary from person to person, but it helps getting to understand him just a little more. I'm gonna go over how I view the scene, and in extension Sans as a whole, to really explain the amount of hoops you need to go through to really make the scene make sense. To get into this, we're finally gonna talk about the famous fight, and while I could go over how absolutely brilliant the fight is constructed through his knowledge over us and how he whoops your ass on a similar level to Undyne, I want to focus on what he tells you. We all know the infamous distinction he makes between going back and the surface, showing clear homesickness to a world he cannot go back to and had to settle for what he's been given. Sound familiar, doesn't it? He goes on about how hoping for anything feels extremely pointless, as whatever he could want to do, it would just get erased without him ever knowing. Most people came to this fight after a pacifist, so this line in particular is absolutely gutting. But the most interesting bit is when he admits that he isn't sure if all that existentialism he's experiencing is merely an excuse for him to not needing to keep fighting, to keep at his hope, to just be comfortable and not suffer trying to go for something bigger. He's resigned himself to the reality, using the reset as the main reason for his inaction, set in action that he regrets in a no-king ending. So with that in mind, it suddenly makes sense why he doesn't really give his all and waits quite literally until the very last moment to actually do something. Because of that, it kind of made me question if the promise would have really changed anything. If his core belief is determined by the futility of his actions, did he really need a promise to not engage with us and kill us on the spot? If he fundamentally never thought it'd make a real difference, wouldn't it be much easier then to just stay laid back and do nothing? What's the point in looking after us and making that promise if in the end he was probably never actually gonna do anything because of said worldview? Sure, with Flowey, you could argue that Sans could maybe act a lot sooner if it weren't for that promise, but in the fight monologue he never mentions how his promise affected his decision to restrain himself. The only reason that he does anything is because he has run out of excuses to not act. He can't afford not to care anymore. And that's when it kind of clicked to me. The promise he made to Toriel was never a means to restrain himself. It's just an excuse. You might not relate to this, but how often have you had a chance to do something under the guise of it being a favor when there's a more selfish reason behind it? How often have you used your relatives' chores or their misfortune as an excuse to not hang out with friends because you didn't know how to just say no to an event or not want to engage in an activity you had zero interest in? It might be true, but really, it's a layer added to something that gives you the ultimate excuse to be selfish under the guise of a selfless reason. After all, Sans never specified how sincere he is with that promise, only that he's grown to respect Toriel to a point where he'd feel like a disappointment if he said no to it. It actually even explains why he doesn't like making promises in the first place. With the lack of belief of it all mattering, there's no sense of obligation to commit to promises. It's a responsibility he simply cannot handle. At least, he doesn't think he can. But this one promise that give him the ultimate excuse to not partake in the human hunting, open up to hope in finally breaking the barrier, is the best argument he can give why he shouldn't get himself involved. But because of said connection, there is a sincerity of wanting to respect it. Even if he doubts it's gonna make a real change, there is a sincere desire to at least try. And for him, the best way he knows he can somewhat keep it is by doing what he's already good at. Make us feel safe, have a body to talk to, have a familiar face everywhere. That's already something he sort of strives to do in Snowden for others, including Papyrus. It's the most passive thing he can do that still gives comfort for others around him. Which is why, when you kill Papyrus, he's recognizing that there is no point in being buddies with you. You taking away his main reason to give that comfort to people is his sign to dip out. He tried his best with his methods and failed, so he might as well just stay back. In the end, he knows there's no point in confronting you, so he just hopes in judgment... last corridor, he can at least try to make you feel as bad as possible for it. Pacifist though, Sans almost goes through an arc to actually see the point of hope, and he sees it in you. The determination to keep going and still stay a good person throughout. It's why by the end of it in last corridor, dear lord, what has the fandom done to me? He trusts you enough that instead of feeling any animosity towards your powers, he's actually kind of excited over it. Of course, not without being at least a bit of a dick about it, but him opening up to you of his lab is pretty huge. It makes his sentiment hit a lot harder knowing how he's really grown to care. It's really tragic as in the Geno fight he admits he sorta hoped to be friends with you once he realized that you are the anomaly. Making it even sadder when you come back after he dunks on you, genuinely looking sad, asking you to not tell the other Sanses that you two were never friends. Now with this whole thing in mind, the inconsistency of the promise makes a whole lot more sense. It's a character flaw. One that fits perfectly within the story, unable to wholeheartedly keep said promise the way Toriel wanted him to stay connected to the main plot, as the meta-ness of it all is intrinsically tied to him. Flowey, at least, exists in both narratives, as it is his story on both sides. Sans, on the other hand, is stuck in said meta-narrative. He cannot act as a protective guardian, but he's willing to at least make you feel home in a world that both of you feel so foreign to. But that doesn't explain the threat and his mocking just yet, and frankly, this is where Sans really starts to show his hands. Remember the Grillbys scene where Sans foreshadows his connection and possible roughhousing he's had with Flowey? Flowey, in turn, foreshadows the ultimate climax with Sans for the Genofight warning you what would happen if he catches on. Except that there is a single instance in the dinner date where he already does that. And it's not the line you're thinking of. If you really think about it, the death threat, while pretty intimidating, doesn't really mean much in the context of this game. The whole point is that you can come back from the dead, retry over and over until you can eventually win. For that, death doesn't feel that much of an issue, as much of a funny sentence that is to say. I may die 1,000 times, but you only need to die once! However, it's the lines of dialogue after that are much more intriguing. He claims to be a good protector, to which he immediately notices that you seem to disagree on that regard. This would be fine if he didn't specify that you didn't die a single time. He says it as a throwaway joke, but really think about what this sets up. This is the very first time in the entire game where he reads your expression to know if you had died before. A skill he uses to mock you with before any time you fight against him in Geno. That, right there, is him catching on to you. That very realization is what Flowey later warns you about, except it's too late. You know now at that very moment that whatever you do, he will know what you are or are capable of doing. That's not to say he doesn't sincerely want to be friends with you or that the promise doesn't mean anything anymore, but that because he spent time with you, he started to suspect something, so it's the perfect opportunity to keep you in your lane, to see if he can get a reaction out of you, to see if he can tell whether you really are that anomaly he's been monitoring this entire time. This is such an amazing display of intelligence on his part. By giving you this threat beforehand, he's now made it clear to you what happens if you abuse that power he's clearly aware of. That threat had never anything to do with wanting to kill you this timeline, nor to do with him hating you. It's all about giving you a warning that while you're starting to give him hope, he's not ready to completely trust you. Displaying his remarkable understanding of this world's function with one single question. Am I wrong? It's kinda genius because for so long, no one really took that line seriously in any of the Let's Plays I've watched, and even in mine, I mostly focus on the threat and how that could be a way to judge your reaction. But this, right here, is when you lost your mystique. When you lost the chance to fool him. He's already onto you. Sure, he might be more clueless in other runs, but that doesn't change the fact that you cannot look at him the same way as you did before. This guy is not your normal pal anymore. He's become the most dangerous person to cross. Your expression is enough for him to gain the upper hand if you wanted to. At the end, however, as mentioned, he genuinely wishes for you to take care, meaning he's willing to see what you do from here on out, using the promise not just as an excuse for his inaction anymore, but also a chance to start seeing hope again. And in the last corridor, he genuinely believes in you, no longer held down by pessimism and really rooting for your success. Almost like a proud dad. His ass is not parents material, not canonically at least, but it shows he's starting to heal from it, and considering how interested he is in knowing embarrassing stories about you, it actually makes sense for people wanting to see him fill the role of a smug uncle. Is that the only way you could read the scene? Probably not. There's maybe a more sinister way you could look at it, but personally, Sans does show a lot of kindness to others, even if not in the conventional way you expect him to. A very minor thing that I always loved is when you ask for the ketchup at Grillbys. He'll prank you and spill your food, but ultimately just gives you his food to make up for it. He's flawed. He's in a way broken by life experiences, and it's not something easy to come out of, but he could still be happy. Whatever he's been through that gave him that nihilistic worldview that's made him the way he is, it's a distant tragedy now. Speaking of distant tragedies, the last little thing I want to add as kind of a conclusion is talking about the track that plays here. It's Raining Somewhere Else. I unfortunately am not musically trained to give you the technical genius of this track, but I don't believe I need to really convey how important this track really is. If you pay attention, it's essentially a slow jazz version of the original Sans theme. It's honestly amazing how Toby turned a goofy theme song into the most somber melody that is even more haunting, slowed down with a different pitch when you get to his laugh. It's nostalgic, it's melancholic, very fitting for whatever Sans' backstory could entail. Is he from another world? Is he specifically from Deltarune? Or is it just a time he cannot turn back to? Who's to say? The fact the leitmotif is just this goofy theme really emphasizes how his whole person can change the more you go deeper, discovering the deep sadness that lies within. There's also the title that brings up a lot of questions. After all, it physically cannot rain in the underground. There can be imitations of rain and waterfall, but it's not really the same. You can read this in two ways. Either see the rain as a tragedy to happen from a distance, or freedom the monsters do not have, far away that they cannot reach. I've seen someone say that they see the rain as a hint to the Gener run, as in there being a timeline out there closing in, predicting said tragedy. Personally though, I've always interpreted the rain as symbolically something that indicates a tragic event that's happened in the past and Sans trying not to think about it. Trying to be in the moment to, in a way, not think about the rain anymore. I like the idea that in the end of Deltarune there might be an apocalypse sort of setting and the last track that plays being titled It's Raining, while the world ends in a storm. However way you choose to interpret the scene or this track, there is a level of complexity and reading you need to go through to remotely get a satisfying answer, and even then, it could still be wrong or overreaching. Personally, I don't think we'll get the full answers in Deltarune, not just cause this guy has had the exposure of a lifetime and I can't really see him become more relevant aside background stuff that we can discover as the story progresses, but also because, in a way, the whole point of Sans is to accept the loss of whatever he cannot get back, letting go of any clear answers and live in the moment to at least get hope for a better tomorrow. It's in the past now, after all. So, for now, let's focus on what's to come and let it rain somewhere else. I hope I summarized the many facets of this single scene and how it kind of caused this complicated mess that gave people the different impressions people have of him. I'm not necessarily saying that it's the only thing people look at in terms of how he should be depicted, but I think it summarizes it pretty nicely. Thank you for watching. I am not really a video essay person, but I thought, hey, I've had this brain rot for the last 7 months trying to catch up on lost time, so why not give it a shot, right? Take care, everyone. Okay, but Megalovania is a legit great track. Fuck you for ruining it by overplaying it everywhere. I swear to God!